On June 3rd, 1812, Lieutenant Woolsey, unaware of Madison's war message, sailed out of Sackett's Harbour with the Oneida and her 88-man crew. While cruising westward, Woolsey sighted 3 vessels he believed were headed for the Genesee River and gave chase. As darkness fell, the wind lightened, forcing Woolsey to wait out the night under short sail. At daybreak, he discovered 2 schooners near the American shore that he suspected to be 2 of the 3 pursued the day before. Woolsey gave chase and captured one of them, the Lord Nelson from Prescott, Upper Canada. Woolsey was told the vessel was destined for Newark on the Niagara Peninsula in Canada. The captain had only a loose journal and a bill of lading for part of his cargo, but no register, license or clearance to comply with American customs regulations. Woolsey was unable to learn whether the Lord Nelson was hovering along the U.S. coast to smuggle cargo ashore or to take on property for the Canadian markets in violation of the embargo law. But appearances were such as to warrant suspicion of intention to smuggle both ways, Woolsey claimed. He ordered the Lord Nelson confiscated and sent to Sackett's Harbour, with a new crew from the Oneida. The other schooner, however, managed to escape. While cruising off Oswego on June 26th, the search for vessels infringing on the embargo laws continued. Woolsey learned that war had been declared and immediately set sail for Sackett's Harbour to alert General Brown and his New York militia of the 4th Infantry Brigade. In the northern section of Military District No. 9, this district, comprised of New York north of the Catskills and Vermont, was one of the most important because it was one of the largest and most exposed in the country. Brown's responsibilities within the district stretched between St. Regis, south of Montreal on the St. Lawrence River, and Oswego. From Albany, Governor Tompkins already ordered the frontier posts reinforced by detachments of militia from the adjoining counties, while Woolsey intended to fill the Oneida's crew and marine complement by asking Brown to furnish him with some of his militia. The Oneida was prepared for a cruise when word arrived at the harbour that the provincial marine fleet had also been ready. The 22-gun Royal George, the 14-gun Earl of Moira, the new schooner Prince Regent, and the schooner Simcoe were assembled off Kingston. Woolsey had no doubt that they would dare an attack on the Oneida, as rumours from Canada claimed the British had already captured or destroyed all the US merchant ships on the lake except 3. Accordingly, Woolsey ordered the Julia, still at Oswego, fitted out with the 32-pounder as soon as possible. The captured schooner, Lord Nelson, was hurriedly equipped with 6 6-pounders and given a new name, the Scourge. In the meantime, General Brown urged Governor Tompkins to forward arms and munitions and suggested that a force should be stationed at Cape Vincent and Ogdensburg to keep Kingston in as great a state of alarm as possible. Brown wrote the governor,
"However easy it may be to conquer Canada, I must assure your excellency that without ordnance, we are completely at the mercy of the enemy, whenever they may deem it an object to unite their force and make a serious attack upon us. For though we have as gallant a people as the Lord ever created, we must not expect them to resist heavy ordnance with small arms."
The announcement of war was greeted with anxiety, and many Americans along the frontier prepared to flee inland. Memories of the Revolution and fear of marauding Indians from Canada caused hundreds of frightened families to abandon their homes. One man confided,
"Sad tidings from the country of the St. Lawrence. The inhabitants are panic-struck and flying off in shoals."
Another settler forewarned,
"If the brig Oneida is lost, the Indians from Canada can come over at their pleasure, For fear of this, a great many of the inhabitants on the frontier have moved themselves into the country. Every man in this village has his gun.
Not all Americans were panic-struck. Abner Hubbard, a Revolutionary War veteran and innkeeper at Millen's Bay on the St. Lawrence River, decided to take action. Aided by a few neighbours and a boy, they rowed out and took possession of Fort Haldeman on Carlton Island without ever firing a shot. The fort had only been manned by 3 British soldiers of the 10th Royal Veteran Battalion and 2 women. The next day, another party went out to the island to run off with provisions stored there and to torch the buildings. This accomplished, Hubbard's action put an end to British occupation and caused the 1,800-acre island to be turned over to the United States. Because of Hubbard's timely raid, the terms of the Jay Treaty were finally fulfilled. On July 8th, hoping to find the Julia ready for service, Wolsey set sail for Oswego. To his astonishment, he found that one of her owners, a Scotsman named Matthew McNair, refused to sell her to the Navy. Wolsey proposed to him that 3 unbiased men appraise the vessel for a generous amount, and the Scotsman should then relinquish ownership. When McNair again refused, Wolsey summarily ordered the Julia seized. Wolsey's tars had her rigged and ready to sail, with long 32-pounder and 3 6s on board within the hour. Their mission accomplished, they set out for Sackett's Harbour and left the unhappy Scotsman behind to contemplate his fate. On the morning of July 19th, 1812, Wolsey's fears of a British attack on the Oneida materialised. Earlier that morning, the Provincial Marine captured a small merchant vessel bound for the harbour from Cape Vincent and sent the American crew ashore with the demand that both the Oneida and Lord Nelson be surrendered or the Canadians would burn the village. Shortly thereafter, 5 Provincial Marine vessels, the Royal George, Earl of Moira, Prince Regent, the Duke of Gloucester, and 1 other schooner were discovered bound for Sackett's Harbour. At about 8 a.m., the Oneida got underway in an effort to reach the open lake, but was forced back as the enemy's ships were formed in a line, completely cutting her off. At the same time, the wind was just right to bring the Canadians into Black River Bay. Wolsey's tars made preparations for action. Since the Oneida could not escape, he prevented an enemy broadside by running close to shore near the mouth of the harbour. He ordered his anchor let go, securing the brig, then transferred all starboard guns to the shore battery on the bluff. These were augmented by the long 32-pounder originally intended for. The Oneida posted upon a mound about 6 feet high. Orders were given that the guns were to commence firing as soon as the Canadians came within range. Sailing Master William Vaughan of the U.S. Navy, described by Wolsey as
not a good seaman, but one of the bravest and finest fellows in the world.
Wolsey took charge of the 32-pounder. Throughout the morning, alarm guns fired, and expresses galloped out to summon the neighbouring militia. As the British ships closed, Vaughan fired the 32-pounder at the Royal George from about 1.5 miles distance. The salvo was returned and continued back and forth for about 2 hours.
We hulled the Royal George 3 or 4 times and effectively broke up their intended attack.
Because of confusion seen on the Royal George, Wolsey thought she had been hit. The enemy fleet suddenly tacked and sailed off, but Wolsey expected another attack. He believed they were waiting in the distance for more favourable wind, but the Provincial Marine had had enough, returning to Kingston without accomplishing anything. Wolsey reported,
2 32-pounder shot thrown on shore by the Royal George. We have salvaged it and intend on returning it to them.
This attack, however, was a signal warning. Now Wolsey concentrated on improving the defences of his base. He requested that the New York Navy Yard. Hurry on 30 guns, all to be 6-pounders. 6 of these pieces were to be placed on the newly purchased merchant vessel Niagara, and the remainder mounted in the new fort under construction on the bluff overlooking his anchorage. Wolsey's little victory had bought the Americans valuable time at the eastern end of Lake Ontario. Wolsey's success was not matched elsewhere on the northern frontier. At Detroit, Brigadier General William Hull, governor of Michigan Territory, commanded 2,500 troops poised to invade Upper Canada at Fort Malden. Instead of advancing immediately, Hull issued proclamations to the local population that consisted heavily of recent American settlers, in hopes of bringing them over without bloodshed. However, the settlers of Upper Canada did not. Swarmed to the American standard, and the British forces there were active and ably led. On July 17th, a British detachment captured Michilimackinac, while an American relief column was attacked and defeated by Indians between Detroit and Dayton. When news of these victories rallied the tribes of the Northwest to the British side, Hull became alarmed and rapidly withdrew from Canada, leaving Fort Malden in British hands. Major General Sir Isaac Brock, the daring British commander in Upper Canada, pursued the invaders with a smaller force, placing a shaken Brigadier General Hull in Detroit under siege. In a colossal act of bluffery, Brock demanded that Hull capitulate or face a massacre by Indians with him. Cut off, Hull surrendered his entire numerically superior force. Word of Hull's defeat spread like wildfire, discounting the American notion that Canada would be conquered by a mere matter of marching. Its impact on morale was disastrous. New York Militia Major General Stephen Van Rensselaer and Brigadier General Alexander Smith were preparing to invade Canada across the Niagara River. General Van Rensselaer warned Tompkins,
"The consequences of Hull's defeat must be felt everywhere, but they are particularly distressing upon these frontiers. Alarm pervades the country and distrust among the troops they are incessantly pressing for furloughs. Many are without shoes. Many are sick, while we are, thus, growing daily weaker. Our enemy is growing stronger."
Wolsey, meanwhile, was contemplating an offensive of his own. After consulting with General Brown, Wolsey sent the Julia, accompanied by one of Brown's New York militia rifle companies, on a secret expedition down the St. Lawrence River. The mission was to free several American merchant schooners blockaded at Ogdensburg and escort these vessels back to Sackett's Harbor to be refitted as warships. 2 Canadian schooners, the Earl of Moira and Duke of Gloucester, that were operating with impunity in the St. Lawrence River, were also potential targets. On July 31st, the Julia encountered the 2 vessels and a battery on the north shore near Elizabethtown. A 3.5-hour cannonade ensued without loss of life or significant damage to either side. The Julia sailed on to Ogdensburg, but dared not run the gauntlet back onto the lake with the merchant vessels. For the time being, the merchant ships remained at Ogdensburg blockaded but safe. They lay quiescent until September 6th, when Vaughan led them in a successful dash for the sanctuary at Sackett's Harbor, where they proved a valuable addition to Wolsey's growing armada. British deserters arriving at Sackett's Harbor alerted Wolsey that the Provincial Marine was concentrating at Kingston for another attack. Although the fort and the small blockhouse near the shore was nearly completed and prepared to receive 36 pieces of heavy ordnance, he wanted more protection. He appealed to the Navy Secretary. "It is much to be lamented that we have not sufficient means of defence." Wolsey stressed that with the few guns on hand and the Oneida, we are obliged to defend ourselves against an intrepid and brave enemy of at least 4 times in force. In response to Wolsey's repeated requests, the 1st Regulars, a company of riflemen under aggressive and impetuous North Carolinian Captain Benjamin Forsyth, arrived at the harbour in late July. Forsyth was an ideal partisan fighter and well suited for action on the northern frontier, and it was not long before they were ordered into action. On the night of September 20th, an enterprising General Brown, short of ammunition and unhappy that the war was not being pursued with more vigour and energy, dispatched Forsyth on his first foray into enemy territory. The mission was to seize a large quantity of ammunition known to be stored at Gananoque, a small British post 20 miles below Kingston on the St. Lawrence. One of Brown's exceptional Jefferson County militia officers, Captain Samuel McNitt, and some of his militia accompanied Forsyth on the raid. Shortly after daylight, Forsyth and McNitt landed 95 troops about 2 miles from their destination. Almost immediately they encountered 2 horsemen, one of whom they shot dead, while the other fled toward the village to warn the garrison. Consequently, as Forsyth's men approached the settlement, they discovered some 110 Canadian militia formed and prepared to receive them. The Canadians unleashed a heavy volley of fire as Forsyth marched his troops to within 100 yards of the opposition's line, levelled their pieces, where on command they fired a storm of aimed shots and charged. The Canadians, losing some 10 to 15 men, broke and fled. The Americans quickly rounded up 12 prisoners as well as 3,000 ball cartridges and 41 muskets. Forsyth further ordered 150 barrels of provisions that they were unable to remove burned. Some of the riflemen fired into a civilian's house, wounding a woman inside. Hoping to find something valuable, they broke in and ransacked the place. They carried off some bedding and other items toward the shore, but were stopped by officers before reaching the boats. After burning a small store and raising a little more hell, they embarked for the American shore. Once word of the attack reached Kingston, a detachment of British troops and militia was dispatched to intercept the invaders, but Forsyth had disappeared across the St. Lawrence River. The British crossed in pursuit to the New York side of the river, landing at a place called Britain's Point. Normally, the Americans kept a strong guard here, but upon the approach of the enemy they retreated into the woods. The British found a large blockhouse under construction, which they burned. Nearby, they discovered a large Durham boat and several smaller ones, and these were also destroyed. Unable to locate Forsyth's riflemen, the pursuers returned to the Canadian shore with nothing else to show for their efforts. The following day, on September 22, 1812, Militia Brigadier General Richard Dodge arrived at Sackett's Harbour with a detachment of troops from the Mohawk Valley country. As regional ranking officer, Dodge ordered Brown with the militia under his command to Ogdensburg. This was the first word a surprised Brown had received regarding his replacement at Sackett's Harbour. Brown had previously written Governor Tompkins requesting not to be sent to Ogdensburg if superior officers arrived at the harbour. Nevertheless, he marched to Ogdensburg with 500 Jefferson County militia and took charge of that post. Some time before, the energetic Jacob Brown had requested an appointment in the regular army, but had not received a positive answer. As Brown's tenure in militia service was about to expire, Governor Tompkins had no objection to his transfer into the regular army and assured Brown he would speak with Dearborn about the matter. Meanwhile, Brown, who had already seen extensive service on the frontier, would have to wait for his commission. On October 2nd, in retaliation for the attack on Gananoque, the British cannonaded Ogdensburg from Prescott for 3 hours. 2 days later, with 40 boats loaded with 10 to 15 men each and 6 pieces of artillery, the British followed up with an attempt to storm the town. Brown waited until the assault was within a short distance of the American shore, then commenced a destructive fire. 2 of the British boats were badly damaged, and the others so scattered that the attack was aborted. Brown, with his Jefferson County militia, initiated his military career with a successful defence of Ogdensburg. This news encouraged the sagging hopes of the government, which reeled from the shock of Hull's surrender. It was a small glimmer of hope in a season of despair. Madison, determined to regain the lost Michigan territory, now ordered Brigadier General William Henry Harrison with a newly raised Northwestern Army to drive the British from Detroit. An uneasy General Van Rensselaer at Buffalo, however, informed Dearborn that Hull's surrender enabled the enemy to act either defensively or offensively against him on the Niagara frontier. Shortly thereafter, Brock arrived with his army from Detroit to reinforce the garrison at Fort George. Brock expected an American attack any time. He insisted that if the British army could hold its position just 6 weeks longer, with winter coming on, the American invasion would have to be terminated in a manner little expected in the United States. The Madison administration would have to act decisively and immediately if strategic initiative was to be re-established. Unknown to Woolsey, help was on the way. On September 3rd, the government finally acted with respect to Lake Ontario. Captain Isaac Chauncey, U.S. Navy commander of the New York Navy Yard, received orders from the Navy Department to assume command on Lakes Ontario and Erie.
The season has arrived when your country requires your active services. The President of the United States has determined to obtain command of the Lakes Ontario and Erie with the least possible delay, and the execution of this highly important object is committed to you.
Chauncey was told he could enjoy considerable latitude. This allowed him to purchase, build, and equip any such vessels viewed necessary, and to have forwarded all requisite officers, marines, seamen, provisions, cannon, small arms of every description, slops, warm clothing, watch coats, surgical instruments, medicine, hospital instruments, medicine, hospital stores, cordage, and canvas as required. Finally, he was directed to cooperate with the American army on the frontier. Isaac Chauncey, from the seafaring state of Connecticut, was the master of a vessel at 19 and had made several voyages to the East Indies in ships belonging to John Jacob Astor. Chauncey, in naval service since 1798, had demonstrated ability and resourcefulness. During the Tripolitan Wars, while on a cruise toward Tripoli, fire broke out on board the frigate New York. The ship's powder magazine was loaded with 15,000 pounds of gunpowder. The crew fled in terror in every direction. A steady Chauncey assembled the most frightened men and reminded them that if they did nothing, the gunpowder would explode and they were all dead men. Therefore, they might just as well try to do something to save themselves and be blown through 3 decks as well as one. Encouraged by this logic, the men followed Chauncey below decks, where they successfully extinguished the fire by throwing wet blankets on the flames. 19 men were terribly burned and 14 more died, but the New York was saved. Chauncey possessed impressive organizational skills, which he honed during lengthy supervision of the New York Navy Yard. Chauncey's uncanny ability to organize, even at great distances, would result in the nation's largest wartime fleet. It appeared Mr. Madison had selected the right man to supervise activities on the crucial Lake Ontario front. Upon receipt of his orders, which brought him the temporary rank of Commodore, Chauncey immediately began preparations for his new assignment. He ordered 46 ship carpenters to leave New York, and in the following weeks, hundreds more were dispatched. Chauncey directed Woolsey to provide him with intelligence regarding the enemy's naval strength, as well as information pertaining to merchant craft. that could be purchased by the Navy and converted into warships. Additionally, Wolsey was ordered to procure the necessary timber to build a vessel of 300 tons and a number of gunboats. Finally, Chauncey instructed Wolsey that secrecy was the order of the day.
You will on no account make a second person acquainted with the subject of this letter or the objectives of the government.
On September 7th, 1812, Wolsey received Chauncey's instructions to accelerate the build-up at Sackett's Harbour with more vigour. When the express arrived, Wolsey was preparing to pursue the British squadron up the lake in hopes of singling out one of the enemy vessels. Wolsey, acting upon these new instructions, now considered it imperative to protect the Oneida at all cost. He brought her into Sackett's Harbour and had every available gun mounted in the newly constructed fort. Wolsey dispatched by the same express a return of the British naval strength back to Chauncey in New York. The rider that had departed New York on a Friday for Sackett's Harbour delivered Chauncey's messages, picked up Wolsey's dispatches, and arrived back in New York at 12 o'clock on the following Thursday. He had travelled a distance of 720 miles over some of the worst roads imaginable in 6 days. Chauncey was appreciably impressed. Chauncey's next step was to dispatch Lieutenant Jesse D. Elliott, U.S. Navy, to Lake Erie to start construction of vessels necessary to secure command of that lake. He informed Elliott that he would meet with him as soon as possible and provide him with a plan that would lead to the conquest of Upper Canada. First, however, the Commodore intended to meet with Governor Tompkins in Albany, and together they would push on to Sackett's Harbour. 85 ship carpenters, headed by Henry Eckford, had already left the New York Navy Yard. The following week, an additional 600 men and a detachment of Marines were dispatched. Meanwhile, rigging, anchors, cables, blocks, sail, additional cannon, boarding pikes, medicine chests, instruments, etc., were assembled and sent. After a journey through what the Commodore described as the worst roads I ever saw, particularly near this place, Chauncey and Tompkins reached Sackett's Harbour on October 6, 1812. The governor remarked that
a heavy fall of rain made the weather and roads uncomfortable and retarded our journey. The climate here at present is a winter one. Some flakes of snow fell whilst we were on the journey.
After touring the garrison, Tompkins expressed concern about the health and security of his militia. The only area suitable for encampment was the bluff and neck of land forming the harbour called Navy Point. Tompkins pointed out that the bluff was high and unprotected from westerly winds blowing directly from the lake.
The troops will not be able to endure in tents for a fortnight in such weather as we now have.
To prevent illness from breaking out, he issued orders to build huts as soon as possible. In spite of the raw autumn weather, enthusiasm and relief abounded among the troops. On the opposite side of the harbour, high on the bluff overlooking Black River Bay, another significant fort was under construction. This earthwork was to defend the harbour entrance of the frontier town, as well as the new Navy Yard. Revolutionary War veterans, remembering their own sacrifices 35 years earlier, offered their services without pay for any duty they could perform. As they were frontier countrymen handy with an axe, they set out building huts from white pine, basswood, and other materials found in the adjoining primeval forests. They also shovelled up mounds of earth where guns could be placed. Upon completion of their toil, this new work was appropriately dubbed Fort Volunteer. When the young troops from a new generation of fighting men assembled at Sackett's Harbour, they were greeted by log huts to shield them from the harsh northern winter. Furthermore, once positioned in the fort, Chauncey's guns would protect the warships moored nearby from any contemplated coup de main. An interlocking plan of defense had begun to materialize around the frontier naval base. The governor was convinced that a strike against Kingston as soon as possible would be necessary.
Upon the whole, the sole important object to be attained by the militia stationed at this place is to cooperate with any naval expedition which may be attempted against Kingston.
In preparing for that course of action, Chauncey directed Wolsey to Oswego to purchase 3 more merchant schooners. Once there, Wolsey's sailors took on board naval stores brought from New York City and transported them onto Sackett's Harbor. Meanwhile, Chauncey discreetly seized the opportunity to name his new battery, Fort Tompkins, in honor of his traveling companion. At first inspection, Chauncey found Wolsey's Oneida in good order and prepared for service. He believed that if the guns from New York arrived soon, the vessels at Sackett's Harbor and Oswego could be fitted out by the beginning of November, and he would seek out the Canadians in their own waters. As time went on, the reality of long distances and miserable roads set in. Chauncey became concerned his heavy guns would not arrive in time to support sustained operations that fall, even though Eckford had a 22-gun corvette on the stocks that he hoped to launch in about a week. Since there were no large merchant vessels on Lake Erie that the Navy could procure, Chauncey ordered materials for 2 gun brigs to be prepared by Eckford and his workmen during the winter. These vessels were to be ready for service by the following spring. Because of Chauncey's efforts, Sackett's Harbor and the St. Lawrence frontier appeared secure for the time being, and a pleased Governor Tompkins communicated to General Van Rensselaer on the Niagara frontier that the federal government had finally awakened to its responsibility towards command of the lakes. Greatly encouraged, Tompkins wrote,
"The most unbounded authority has been given to Captain Chauncey, and he will be with you soon. Should you be able to maintain your position a short time longer, these arrangements and reinforcements will place you in a situation of defiance. Nevertheless, logistical concerns were a worry."
Back at Buffalo, an uneasy Van Rensselaer complained to Dearborn that Sackett's Harbor was not a point from which the invasion of Canada could be mounted. Furthermore, he believed the village commanded a disproportionate amount of scarce resources to guard it. "I know of no consideration which ought to claim more than a regiment of troops at that post." Dearborn responded by saying that every effort had been made to send ammunition, medicine, arms, etc., to the Niagara frontier, and explained to his subordinate that the enemy might attempt to seize the naval armaments being concentrated at Sackett's Harbor. This, he felt, justified the sizable garrison. Dearborn stressed to Van Rensselaer that the 7,000 troops at Niagara were sufficient for his contemplated actions. Dearborn felt that it would be best to strike at Kingston from Sackett's Harbor and thereby divert British attention away from Niagara. He reasoned that if Chauncey obtained the command on Lake Ontario, Kingston could be taken, cutting off all supplies and reinforcements to Upper Canada. In that case, everything above Kingston would fall to American arms, whether or not Harrison's army succeeded him. Reconquering the Mexican territory. Lieutenant General Sir George Prevost, Governor-in-Chief of British North America and Commander of British forces, watched these developments with mounting interest. He hoped that the US would consider the possibility of negotiating an end to the war, as Britain would no longer enforce the order in council, one of the principal reasons for the war. The 45-year-old Prevost was considered knowledgeable in American affairs. Born in New Jersey, he was the son of an army officer and as a young man joined his father's regiment, the 60th Foot, also known as the Royal Americans. During the opening years of the French Revolutionary Wars, he again served in the West Indies and became Lieutenant Governor of St. Lucia in 1798. By 1811 he was appointed Governor-in-Chief and Commander of British forces in North America. Prevost, who had long feared an American invasion of Canada, offered Dearborn an opportunity to cease hostilities on the frontier until the President's decision on the British offer of an armistice could be weighed. Madison, however, rejected Prevost's proposal and told Dearborn to proceed with the utmost vigour in your operations. The President did not want to lose the possibility of gaining possession of British posts on the Niagara frontier and Kingston. He believed the military should relentlessly pursue strategic superiority on the lakes, as other concerns were ancillary. General Brock was determined to stop American momentum. He was convinced that Van Rensselaer's army was so wretched in organisation and discipline that a British offensive might well be desirable. His superior, the ever-cautious Prevost, believed that no notable advantage could be gained from infuriating the Americans as long as Britain remained transfixed with Napoleon in Europe. Military retribution might even serve to turn growing anti-war sentiment, especially in New England, into a more aggressive stance against the British in Canada. Prevost thereupon recommended a policy which would promote the dwindling away of such a force, the American army, by its own ineffective means. Although the British army in Canada stretched from Halifax to Lake Superior, the command and logistical problems of Prevost and Brock were not as complex as those of the Americans. Land transportation on the northern shores of the Great Lakes was difficult and expensive, but nevertheless much better developed than the outright primitive roadways that existed on the newly settled American southern shores of the Great Lakes. Furthermore, British units serving in Canada were more efficient and better equipped. The Canadian militia, however, was no more competent than its American counterpart. The best qualified of these men were often recruited into provincial regular regiments and the long-service, quasi-regular units, which were under regular British Army discipline. Furthermore, these units could serve anywhere in British North America, whereas the militia would only serve locally and for short periods of time. Prevost knew that the province of Lower Canada could provide troops stationed there with food and cattle to sustain them, and deficiencies could be compensated for by contracting with American farmers from northern New York and Vermont willing to smuggle their goods across the border. Coupled with this, Lower Canada could by extraordinary exertions supply Upper Canada with supplies needed as long as Britain was able to control the supply routes through the Great Lakes and remain on the defensive. The inexperienced American army, on the other hand, would have to be supplied from a fledgling industrial base located hundreds of miles away from the theatre of operations. War material would have to be transported over the poorest of roads, often made impassable by winter snow and cold, as well as spring rains and mud. With this in mind, Prevost reasoned that a successful American invasion was wholly impractical given Hull's debacle at Detroit. He therefore ordered Brock not to go on the offensive, but to maintain a defensive posture and to await developments. Finally, on October 13, 1812, the long-awaited Niagara invasion began. Van Rensselaer's army of nearly 1,000 regulars crossed the Niagara River to Queenston, Upper Canada. The 2,000-plus man militia, invoking their constitutional rights at the last minute, refused to leave the regulars, deprived of their support, were soon overwhelmed by 600 British regulars, supported by 400 Canadian militia and a number of Indians. The toll exacted from the Americans was heavy. As many as 500 were reported killed, but the exact number will probably never be known. The British losses were far less, but they included Major General Brock. Upper Canada, however, was safe for the time being. After the fiasco on the Niagara frontier, Van Rensselaer resigned his commission and withdrew into retirement. Americans were once again stunned as word of another disaster swept the country. General Van Rensselaer wrote William Eustis, Secretary of War, "I can only add that the victory was really won, but lost for the want of a small reinforcement. 1/3 part of the idle men might have saved all." General Smith wrote Dearborn,
"Place no confidence in the detached militia. They have disgraced the nation. Give me a clear stage, men, and money, and I will retrieve your affairs or perish."
Dearborn ordered Smith to assume command. He strongly advised the general to communicate with Harrison, who was marching, Dearborn hoped, to retake Detroit. This, Dearborn assumed, would reverse the disasters of the past 3 months, while he himself prepared to carry out an attack on Montreal by way of Lake Champlain. Dearborn, ill-tempered, in declining health and nicknamed Granny, mustered 3,000 regulars and some 2,000 militia for the advance north from Plattsburgh. Lieutenant Colonel Zebulon Pike, now on the northern frontier, and about 600 of his men advanced along the Lacolle River. Mistakenly believing it to be British, his troops opened fire on an approaching militia unit while, at almost the same time, an enemy force advanced from another direction. Pike's troops turned and fired at the oncoming column and quickly withdrew, leaving their dead and wounded behind. The New York militia, upon which the army depended, again refused to cross into Canada, invoking its constitutional rights. Shortly thereafter, without explanation, Dearborn ordered his troops to return to Plattsburgh and into winter quarters. Dearborn's 3-pronged invasion of Canada collapsed in ruins. From an American perspective, the war had gone from bad to worse. Montreal was left untouched, and Upper Canada was still in British hands. On the oceans, American privateers were marauding British shipping, but these encounters were only irritating, not fatal. Few in the United States had expected such a turn of events, for most believed 500 Kentucky militia could take all of Canada, and that victory was a mere matter of marching north. The invasion of Canada had fallen terribly short of American expectations because of faulty planning and incompetent execution by a nation wholly unprepared for warfare. These unsavoury tidings, however inauspicious, were simply a harbinger of things to come. Worse was yet to follow. By the beginning of November, the industrious Chauncey had purchased 9 merchant schooners, varying from 50 to 100 tons. 5 of these were at Sackett's Harbour, while 4 lay at Oswego. Because of wretched roads leading north from Utica through the Black River country, Chauncey ordered his guns and stores transported by the Oneida waterway to Oswego. There they were loaded on ships and brought on to the harbour. Chauncey believed he would have his squadron ready to sail by November 15th, in which case, "I shall most certainly seek the enemy." Since the coast of Lake Ontario freezes over, he was apprehensive the British would lay up their ships for winter before he could engage them in decisive battle. If the British did lay up their ships, he planned to make an attack upon the forts and ships at Kingston by marching over the ice that winter. Chauncey urged Dearborn to increase the regular army at Sackett's Harbour for the protection of Eckford's shipbuilding efforts. Echoing Van Rensselaer and Smith's words, he wrote, "I have no confidence in the militia at this place," Sackett's Harbour, or Ogdensburg. Chauncey then asked Dearborn to direct the army to cooperate in conducting offensive operations with him. He believed the American army could land at Kingston, covered by his naval force, and we should take or destroy all their naval force, forts and public stores. Then, if I am successful at Kingston, I shall proceed down the St. Lawrence River and attack Prescott. Chauncey laid out a plan that he believed had a good chance of success. Now he needed to implement it. The Commodore appeared to be ahead of his schedule, for on November 8th he made his first appearance on the lake in force, with the Oneida flying his broad pennant in concert with the Conquest's Hamilton, Governor Tompkins, Pert, Julia, and Growler. He sought to intercept the Canadian vessels running supplies to the British Army at Kingston. The fleet discovered and pursued the Royal George, but as night fell, she ran into the Bay of Quinte and the Americans lost sight of her. When morning came, she was seen lying in Kingston Channel. Over the course of the day, the U.S. fleet pursued the Royal George into Kingston Harbour. There, a hot engagement took place for 1 hour and 45 minutes, with the Royal George supported by land battery. Hard winds compelled Chauncey to withdraw by nightfall. He ordered the fleet to anchor with a view toward renewing the attack at daybreak. The pilots considered the situation unsafe. Therefore, Chauncey weighed anchor and pushed farther out into the lake. He believed the Royal George was so heavily damaged that she was forced to sail close to shore to prevent her from sinking. Another vessel, the Simcoe, was so shattered that she sank in shallow water before reaching the wharf. Chauncey had captured 3 vessels with their crews. One was burned, and the other 2 were brought into Sackett's Harbour and added to the burgeoning OSE force. The British, meanwhile, drew a sigh of relief. Colonel John Vincent, in command at Kingston, notified Prevost that the Americans had exchanged shots with his batteries and the Royal George until nightfall. "It is to be lamented that the guns we have here are only 9-pounders. The enemy kept too great a distance. Still a few shots struck them. The whole of their fire was directed at the Royal George. She suffered but little. 1 man killed, a 32-pounder shot lodged in her bottom, and her rigging much cut. I suspect this fleet will return to Sackett's Harbour without having anything to boast of." On his return to the harbour, an exuberant Chauncey crowed to Dearborn that he now had the command of Lake Ontario and was ready to cooperate with the army at any point to attack the enemy. Captain James Brock of the 49th Regiment, a nephew of the late General Brock, was one of the British officers taken prisoner and brought to Sackett's Harbour. Brock was given a grand tour of the Navy Yard by a boastful Chauncey himself and witnessed first-hand the American build-up. The Commodore was delighted to learn that his build-up would be properly protected. His request for additional regular troops was granted, and Dearborn informed him that the intelligent and energetic Colonel Alexander A.B. Maycomb, with his newly raised 3rd Regiment of Artillery, would soon be on the march. Macomb prepared to leave the staging area of Greenbush on the east bank of the Hudson River across from Albany with his 1st Independent Command. At Greenbush, cantonment as many as 5,000 soldiers could be accommodated in the extensive wooden barracks and officers' quarters. Men new to harsh military life, as well as regular and militia units, were trained and equipped there, for this was the principal staging area for the northern frontier. From Greenbush, supplies, uniforms, weapons, artillery, and troops were gathered and forwarded northward to Plattsburgh and westward to Niagara and Sackett's Harbour. Chauncey feared Macomb's regiment, moving north on terrible roads, would not arrive in a timely fashion. To make matters worse, a severe snowstorm underscored the fact that winter was on the verge of setting in. On November 21st, earlier than expected, the colonel and his 400 troops arrived after a grueling 13-day journey. Written in Macomb's orderly book, the last day of the journey was thus described: "This morning started earlier, and we proceeded on the march through a lone and dreary road. After tracking 10 miles arrived at Sackett's Harbour, a miserable, cold place on the shore of Lake Ontario. The Commodore observed that Macomb's artillery had marched with uncommon expedition through roads which to an officer of less zeal would have appeared impassable. The consequence, however, is that his men are worn down with fatigue. They necessarily require a few days to recruit. Although running ahead of schedule, Chauncey regretted not having been at Sackett's Harbour just 1 month earlier. He felt he could have taken every town on the lake, but now the weather was becoming so blustery, it was apparent little could be accomplished that winter. Once upon receiving information that British ships were desperately trying to supply posts westward, Chauncey ventured out to intercept them. He encountered a blizzard instead. 3 different times during the night, his ships were nearly wrecked upon the rocks of the Galu Islands. It was blowing such gale force that the schooners found it almost impossible to maintain their course. Ice formed so fast on the rigging and on the slides of the carronades that they would have been useless in a fight. Chauncey thought it best to seek the safety of port and gave the signal for the squadron to return to the harbour, where, miraculously, it arrived intact on the same evening. The harsh northern winter was now upon them, and cold had settled deep into the earth. By November 22nd, the harbour and upper parts of the bay were frozen over, and it had snowed continuously for the last 3 or 4 days. William Vaughan and other experienced lake pilots voiced concern to Chauncey that it was extremely risky to navigate the lake at this advanced season. They warned that the storms on Lake Ontario were much more dangerous than those on the Atlantic coast. Nevertheless, 2 more attempts were made to sail to Fort Niagara and deliver guns and other military stores. Both failed. Fierce winds and heavy seas drove the ships back to the safety of the harbour. Moreover, intelligence came in that the British had collected 3,000 men at Kingston, 1,000 of whom were reported to be regulars of the 49th and Glengarry regiments. Chauncey also suspected that 1,000 militia and 9 to 12 pieces of ordnance were located at Prescott. At the urging of General Brown, Chauncey pondered the idea of attacking that place and bringing off the enemy's gun. In the end, he concluded that the risk of getting his fleet frozen in the St. Lawrence River was just too great. He chose instead to remain secure at Sackett's Harbour. Because the log barracks at the harbour were occupied by other militia units, Maycomb's troops were housed in tents. The colonel was eager to get them hutted for the winter, and work began on additional quarters just west of Fort Tompkins along the margin of Black River Bay toward Horse Island. Large enough to hold a regiment, 2 long rows of barracks, known as the Basswood Cantonment, were built of logs, and weatherboarded officers' quarters were assembled nearby. A barrack with brick fireplaces was built for the Marines, while a stockade enclosing the blockhouse was thrown around Fort Tompkins and its powder magazine. Nor was the Navy idle. Eckford constructed barracks, blacksmith shops and mess halls for his shipwrights, but there was still much left to do to guard against a surprise attack that might come at any time. On November 26, Eckford's next creation on Lake Ontario was launched amidst cheering hundreds. The Madison was a beautiful corvette with a 112-foot keel, 32-foot 6-inch beam, 11-foot 6-inch depth of hold, displacing 580 tons and able to mount 24 32-pounder carronades. She had been constructed in the unbelievably short space of 45 days. 9 weeks earlier, her timber had been growing in the forest. Chauncey predictably beamed to the Navy Department that when fitted and manned, she will not disgrace her name or flag. In spite of the arrival of Macomb's troops, Chauncey grew apprehensive about the exposed condition of his naval force. He warned Washington that in view of the immense importance of the command on the lake, there can be but little doubt that the enemy will make a desperate effort to regain the ascendancy he has lost. He argued that a further increase in the size of the regular garrison was necessary to protect the place, and reasoned that any troops brought there could be transported by his ships to any point needed much easier than if marched. Moreover, Chauncey rationalized, the preservation of our vessels, consequently of our ascendance upon the lakes, without which we cannot conquer Canada, is of the very first importance. Chauncey also urged the Secretary to send an experienced officer to command and outfit the newly launched Madison as soon as possible. The department responded by ordering New York City native Master Commandant James Etty native Master Commandant James Et Leonard, U.S. Navy, to the northern station. Interestingly enough, Chauncey had endured a squabble with Leonard earlier that summer when a squadron of gunboats, one of which flew a broad pennant, entered New York harbor. Chauncey sent a dispatch boat to inform the intruder on his station that he and only he was authorized to fly such a flag. Leonard retorted that he had his own separate command and was operating under the orders of the Secretary of the Navy, and continued on his way. This was the first, but not the last time, Leonard thumbed his nose at Isaac Chauncey. Leonard may have believed his career was sufficiently distinguished to flaunt authority. In 1799, Leonard entered the Navy as midshipman. He had served on the Constellation under Thomas Truxton in the bloody combat with the La Vengeance during the Quasi War with France. After duty with the Mediterranean Squadron during the Tripolitan Wars, he spent 6 years' service on the New Orleans gunboat station. In 1807, Leonard fought a pistol duel with Lieutenant Jacob Jones, thus Navy at only 9 feet distance. He was seriously wounded but recovered. At the time war was declared, Leonard found himself with the gunboat service along the East Coast. Now, the Navy assigned this controversial officer to Sackett's Harbour as Chauncey's second-in-command. By the end of November, the weather had become so blustery that Chauncey suspended all further operations on the lake. He decided to lay up his fleet for the winter and moored it in such a way as to afford mutual protection. If the British were to collect 2,000 or 3,000 men at Kingston, Chauncey calculated that they could easily march to Sackett's Harbour in 12 hours over the ice. Such a force could then easily take possession of the American guns and turn them upon the vessels and destroy them, Chauncey prophesied.
Viewing the immense importance that the command of this lake is to defeat the enemy in Upper Canada, no one can doubt but that he will use every exertion and make any sacrifice to regain the ascendancy he had lost.
Chauncey's anxiety over the safety of his growing fleet compelled him to urge Dearborn to order 1,000 additional regulars to Sackett's Harbour. Militia will not do, he wrote. The force which is now here consists of about 500 regulars and 1,000 militia. Not more than one of the latter are fit for duty. With winter deepening, Maycomb's troops were busy constructing artillery sheds and enlarging Fort Volunteer. The Navy was rebuilding and strengthening the blockhouse at Fort Tompkins to guard against a surprise attack. The only other troops relatively close by were 600 militia under Brown and Forsyth's company of riflemen, all at Ogdensburg. Being in such an exposed forward position, Brown and Forsyth had been instructed by Dearborn not to make incursions into Canada and risk retaliation. Chauncey felt the riflemen would be a welcome addition at Sackett's Harbour for the purpose of manning the blockhouse and requested their return. He shared no such sentiment, however, for Brown's militia. Chauncey was also concerned about the lack of a command structure that would facilitate cooperation between the Army and the Navy, but no office existed to coordinate them. This war was the first full-scale conflict waged under the Constitution, and because no formal strategy-making institutions existed beyond the President as Commander-in-Chief, Chauncey sent a communique to Washington to find answers.
From the nature of my command, it will be frequently essential and necessary for me to act on shore with the army, a large body of men under my immediate orders. Although I have an order from the department to consider my rank as that of a brigadier general, yet some of the officers in the army may be disposed to dispute the legality of such an order and refuse to recognize me as an officer, and as the field of battle is not the proper place to settle that point, it should wish, sir, that some order may be taken upon the subject. My idea is that the President may give some brevet rank that the officers of the army would recognize while I'm acting on shore. I am authorized to state that Colonel Macomb coincides with me in opinion as respects the relative rank of officers in the two services, and that he has no objections to serve under me whenever the public service may require me to act on shore.
At Kingston, meanwhile, officers of His Majesty's regular forces held similar, less than flattering views toward the non-professionals. On December 3, British Captain Andrew Gray, acting Deputy Quartermaster General, sent a sobering report to Prevost. Gray declared that the unfavourable description he had received concerning the fitness of the provincial marine was true. The officers of the marine seem to be destitute of all energy and spirit, and are sunk into contempt in the eyes of all who know them. He reported that only 17 men on board the Royal George were capable of doing their duty, and the Earl of Moywarra had only 10 able seamen. Because of the efforts of the enemy, he stressed that nothing could save the Navy from destruction the moment navigation opens in the spring. Because Gray had a maritime background and supervised dockyard activities at Kingston, he was the closest thing the British Army had to an amphibious warfare expert on Lake Ontario. Furthermore, he served on the staff at Kingston and consulted at the highest levels of military affairs in Canada. Presently, Gray believed the American and British forces were about equal, but as soon as the Madison was fitted out at Sackett's Harbour, he predicted we shall be completely at their mercy. Gray's thinking was corroborated by the recently released Captain Brock. Brock, captured in the attack on Kingston, had been permitted to return home upon his parole, but he brought back valuable information concerning American preparations at Sackett's Harbour. "Brock," Gray exclaimed, "confirms the reports of the exertions the enemy are making at that place. As soon as the Madison was launched, another ship was to be laid down on the same slip, to be launched in the spring." This came from a very communicative and full of confidence Chauncey himself. Gray summarized that little solace could be found in the state of Kingston's defences. Only 6 or 8 small ship guns were mounted on the batteries, even though there was a blockhouse on the high ground. The post was capable of making only a feeble resistance against the numbers the Americans had the power to eventually bring against them. He felt, conversely, that Sackett's Harbour could itself be attacked if we were in sufficient force. This was the first manifestation of a recurring theme. Gray was under the impression that there were only 2 gun batteries defending Sackett's Harbour, and that it was devoid of blockhouses or enclosed works. The force protecting Sackett's Harbour, he stated, consists of about 1,000 militia in a wretched state of equipment, much discontented and very sickly, 1 company of artillery, regulars, and about 200 ship carpenters and seamen. Gray suggested that 1 good regiment provided with snowshoes, 3 or 4 pieces of artillery on sleighs, would be sufficient to carry the place and destroy the ships. The distance from Kingston to Sackett's Harbour, by way of Gravelly Point near Cape Vincent on the St. Lawrence River, was about 45 miles, 31 miles mostly through woods, with scattered settlements and partial clearings. It seemed an inviting prospect. Steps were taken at Sackett's Harbour to prevent any such moves against the growing post. On December 4th, 1812, Chauncey issued general orders that no officer or man on any pretext whatsoever was to sleep out of the vessel to which he belonged without permission first obtained from him in writing. He ordered that every vessel is to be kept in a state of perfect preparation night and day to repel any attack that may be made by the enemy. The next day, Chauncey sent his trusted sailing master, William Vaughan, under a flag of truce to Kingston to gain information of the strength of British-Canadian force. Vaughan learned that 600 of the 49th Regiment and nearly 1,000 militia were present, with about 2,000 additional militia that could be called in on 24 hours' notice. He also discovered that about 500 men of the Glengarry Regiment had marched to York. York was the provincial capital of Upper Canada and the most important depot for naval and military supplies routed to Niagara and Detroit. It was well defended by blockhouses and possessed a good harbour and docking facilities. It was ideally located and could draw on some 1,500 local militia for its defence. Furthermore, Vaughan learned that since mid-November, several attempts had been made to send the Royal George, Earl of Moira, and a schooner loaded with military stores and clothing for the British Army and Indians at Fort George by way of York. On seeing the US squadron, however, the ships ran back to the safety of Kingston, and the British abandoned all hope of getting up the lake that winter. They consequently laid up their vessels for the season. Vaughan was not able to discover whether or not the British were planning an attack on Sackett's Harbour during the winter. Ironically, he learned the British were frightened of one from them. Vaughan's information induced Chauncey to feel somewhat more secure. Accordingly, he and Eckford journeyed to Buffalo early in December to determine the needs of the Lake Erie fleet for the spring campaign. Chauncey left orders for Captain Leonard, en route to Sackett's Harbour from New York during his absence. He turned command of the harbour over to Leonard, instructing him to be vigilant and see that all vessels were prepared and to repel any attack. Leonard was also to fit out the Madison as quickly as possible and cause her lower masts and bowsprit to be positioned. He was to ensure that 12 guns were mounted and always kept at the ready. Her sails and rigging were to be examined and dried when they arrived from New York and Leonard ways, to have her prepared for service for the spring campaign without fail. When Leonard arrived at the harbour, he conscientiously followed these orders. Unfortunately, he caused an uproar in the village by bringing with him a lady of comfortable virtue whom he passed off as Mrs. Leonard, and who was received socially by the wives of the other officers. When disconcerting rumours began to circulate that Mrs. Leonard was not what she was supposed to be, what passed for genteel society in Sackett's Harbour was thrown into turmoil. Worried about the reputation of his establishment, the proprietor of the tavern where Leonard had procured a room for the lady put the question directly to the naval officer, only to receive the blunt reply that it was none of his business who the woman was, as long as her bills were paid. The lady in question proved to be even less tactful when the sister-in-law of Jacob Brown, a Mrs. Skinner, asked her whether she was legally married to Leonard. She was told that it was nobody's business whether she was Captain Leonard's wife or his houris. By this time, the military and naval community was in an uproar. Matters climaxed when Mrs. Leonard purchased some articles at a store in Brownville, then signed a credit note with the name Fanny Canfield. The storekeeper, who believed her to be the actual wife of the captain, was convinced she had committed forgery and demanded an accounting. Word of the incident quickly spread, reaching Leonard. An angry Leonard rode to Brownville, entering Lawrence's store with a whip in his hand, his dirk by his side, and a negro following him. Leonard demanded the storekeeper.
Beg his and her pardon, or take a horsewhipping.
The intimidated storekeeper suddenly realized a mistake had been made. As he now understood, she did not write the note. Somewhat satisfied, Leonard left after paying all his outstanding accounts. When Chauncey arrived back at the harbour on January 20th, 1813, it did not take him long to find out about his subordinate's disastrous conduct. He immediately summoned Leonard and told him that it had created a considerable vexation in the country, and that it was doing him and the service a serious injury. He insisted Leonard send the lady back to New York whence she came. Leonard assured Chauncey that he was unaware of any discontentment his conduct created, but he would send her away without delay. Within a very short time, Mrs. Leonard departed Sackett's Harbour. Meanwhile, the war was still going on. Chauncey found affairs pretty much as he had left them, but at least the blockhouse construction was progressing reasonably well. He anticipated its completion by February, at which time we shall be able to give the enemy a warm reception if he should pay us a visit this winter. During that same time, 4 deserters from the Royal George arrived at Sackett's Harbour. They revealed that 2 vessels were being built at York, one of which they described as a frigate. They also disclosed that a new 36-gun ship with a 120-foot keel and 30-foot beam was on the stocks at Kingston and would be launched in early April. They further reported that about the middle of December, 130 ship carpenters and 50 sailors had arrived at Kingston. Chauncey summed up the situation by stating that every deserter that comes over, and there are many, gives the same account and says that it is the opinion of the officers that if they do not make a desperate effort to regain the command of the lake, that Canada must fall. In view of this intelligence, Chauncey realized that the British were bent on building sufficient force to ensure them command of the lakes or destroy the American vessels before they could be made operative. Chauncey judged it prudent to build another ship. If the President, Chauncey explained to Navy Secretary Hamilton, should determine to authorize another ship to be built here, it will be proper for me to receive your instructions as early as possible in order that I may prepare her armament and be ready to meet the enemy upon equal terms next spring. Chauncey was determined not only to outbuild the British, but to launch the largest warship on the lake. With his new ship, he hoped to secure undisputed mastery of Lake Ontario when the crucial spring campaign began. In mid-December, Captain Gray journeyed from Kingston to York to survey the situation. He also developed new ideas to improve the defences of Upper Canada. The first and most important was preventing the fleet from falling into American hands. British vessels would not be secure till we can procure officers to command and seamen to man them. This was no easy task. As soon as navigation opened in the spring, Gray suspected Chauncey's first objective would be the destruction or capture of British ships under construction. He suggested that 10 or 12 guns, along with the necessary round shot, be sent immediately to Kingston and York. He further urged a corvette mounting 30 32-pounder carronades be built at York, and 2 more vessels be built of the same class as the Royal George, one at Kingston, the other at Amherstburg on Lake Erie. As far as his initial plan of attacking Sackett's Harbour was concerned, he felt the Americans would eventually strengthen the post by creating an abattis and barricades of wood, of which he has plenty, and has men and carpenters in abundance. Once completed, this abattis would make a surprise assault by the British impractical. Back at Sackett's Harbour, Eckford's carpenters were busily engaged in building their latest vessel. This was similar in size and dimensions to the speedy New York pilot boats. She was to be christened Lady of the Lake and would be employed as a dispatch vessel. Her sails were to be made of the best Russia duck, which, like all other equipment and fittings, was brought from New York. Chauncey wanted a vessel that could communicate rapidly anywhere around the lake with ease, and this sleek little schooner perfectly suited that task. President Madison, reacting to Chauncey's concerns of a possible British attempt to destroy his force, instructed the War Department to supply the post with sufficient troops. The War Department warned Dearborn of the President's anxiety and directed that additional reinforcements be stationed there to thwart hostile moves against it. In early January, Captain Oliver Hazard Perry, commanding officer at Newport, Rhode Island, tendered his services to Chauncey. The Commodore immediately wrote Hamilton requesting that Perry be assigned to Sackett's Harbour as he could be employed to great advantage, particularly on Lake Erie. Additional sailors were ordered to Sackett's Harbour to man the growing fleet. Among them was Isaac Chauncey's younger brother, Wolcott. Lieutenant Wolcott Chauncey did not enjoy the same reputation as his older brother, Eyre. In fact, it was tarnished by an incident that occurred the previous autumn. On October 15th, 1812, the U.S. brig Argus, flying a British flag, fired at and stopped off the Virginia Capes the American merchant vessel Ariadne under Captain Bartlett Holmes, bound for Cadiz. The Argus was commanded by Captain Arthur Sinclair, U.S. Navy of Richmond, Virginia, who sent Lieutenant Chauncey to board the detained American merchantman. Chauncey climbed on board in the undress uniform of the British Navy. He declared to Captain Holmes that the Ariadne was a lawful prize and would be sent to Barbados. In this guise, Chauncey demanded the papers of the American vessel. He then took the papers and her colours back to the Argus, returning some time later with armed sailors. The crew of the Ariadne was ordered by Chauncey off their vessel and onto the American warship. Then he and his sailors began to plunder the American merchantman. Cordage, about 500 pounds of cabin bread, a quantity of beef, pigs, the hen coop, nearly all the cabin furniture, 2 quintals of fish, corn, peas, painters, oil, the carpenter's tools, all the yawl oars, together with all the private stores, were taken. The crew of the Ariadne was threatened to be treated as prisoners of war unless they signed on as sailors with the Argus. Most of the crew decided it was in their best interest to join the United States Navy. Some 39 days later, the captain of the Ariadne and his first mate were released and sent ashore at Martha's Vineyard. Captain Holmes alleged, "I was threatened by Lieutenant Chauncey that in case I exposed the treatment we had experienced, he would shoot me whenever he could meet me again." When this story came out in the newspapers, as it eventually did, it unleashed a storm of controversy that still clouded Wolcott Chauncey when Isaac ordered him north. Before heading out, Isaac cautioned his brother that, "For the honour of the service, you should prevent the men placed in your charge from committing any depredations upon the persons or property of citizens while on the road." Arrangements were made for sleighs and horses to meet Wolcott and his high seas tars at Albany and transport them to the harbour quickly. In addition to orders to behave, while underway, the Commodore stressed that no unnecessary delays would be tolerated.